All right, good morning, Kenya continues. It is 8:38 a.m. And as we had said earlier, this morning is all about the reading culture, the art of reading, the art of writing, what it all takes, even as Africans. Today, I'm joined in studio by Professor Mukoma Ngugi. He is a novelist, an author. He is someone who is also a poet, someone who has done so much work in this country. And that is a person that we are having this morning. Thank you very much for joining me.
No, thank you for having me. Thank you for having me on your show.
You have lots of books. And in fact, most of your books here, we have the rise of the African novel, politics of language, identity and ownership, the novels Mrs. Shaw, Black Star, Nairobi Hit, and even more books even of poetry like
I've been busy. I've been busy.
You've been busy. This is a lot of work. How do you see the case of African literature in the global perspective?
Well, I think now the African literature has made a mark on the global on the global stage. But of course, for my generation, we're following on the footsteps of or rather we are resting on the shoulders of people like Chinua Achebe, and also my father, Ngugi Thiong'o, and that generation of African writers who actually, we could say they were responsible for creating African literature as we know. Though, of course, there was an earlier literature from South Africa, for example. There is a lot of literature from the late 1800s to the early 1920s that we don't talk about. But for my generation, really, we tend to rest on their shoulders on the global stage, yeah.
And you've talked about Chinua Achebe, even your father, Ngugi Thiong'o. Has he had an influence on your writing?
Of course. But let me just add something quickly. So, even when we talk about the global stage, though, we should also ask what's getting put on the global stage. So, books in African languages, for example, even in translation, hardly ever make it to the global stage. So there is that as well. When we talk about even world literature and global stage, what's getting admitted into that space. Of course, my father, he has been a great influence. I keep saying I grew up seeing him writing books. I would take him tea in the morning, and he'll be in his office writing. After he went into exile, I spent a lot of time in his office reading the books in his office. So I was surrounded by literature. And because of that, all through, pretty much throughout my whole life. So when it came down to writing a book myself, I didn't have any doubts about that. But he has also influenced me in terms of what I call political courage, right? Because it comes from the generation of political activisms, that were, I grew up during the Moi dictatorship, right? So I got to witness his courage as first during the Kenyatta presidency when he was taken off to jail, detained, and then forced into exile. So I don't know, that political courage of using my pen as a political tool.
And even as you talk about these, the global perspective, reading there, as Kenyans, or let me take it even to the global aspect, even as human beings, most people, do you see that do we appreciate the art of reading? Do people like reading? Do we even appreciate, like, for example, your books, the reception that you get? Do people appreciate literature?
No, they do. People appreciate literature. People appreciate culture, right? Because it's a reflection. Culture is a reflection of who we are, right? A total reflection of who we are. But I do think we have some myths about the reading culture that are not quite accurate, or rather we attribute the wrong things for a low reading culture, right? And, right now I'm a visiting professor at St. Paul's University, right? And they have a biblical translation center. And one of the people I was talking to there said that God speaks to us in our languages, right? There's there's no reason why you'll be lying in bed, and then God comes and speaks to you in French.
He'll speak to you in your own
So exactly. So he'll speak to you in your own language. And we need to treat literature that way. We need literature in our own languages. Otherwise, in terms of reading culture, everybody reads the Bible because it exists in their language. So people read. It's just that they can't read the language in which we are writing in.
And as you talk about language, your father, Professor Ngugi Thiong'o, also had stated that he believes people who have mastered foreign languages but are not conversant with their own in their ethnic groups are enslaved. What are your comments on that?
No, there's a lot of truth in that, right? And you can even break it down in terms of how we learn languages, right? Now, studies have been done to show that we learn a second language faster and better if we master our own language, right? So in a way, even our approach to the Kenyan educational system of punishing students for speaking their their mother tongues is actually counterproductive. If actually the Kenyan educational system wants people to master English, then it would make more sense for them to make sure that the children are conversant with their languages. And also we should point out some ironies, right? Here now we're talking about learning Mandarin, right? Learning Chinese in Kenya, right? When we're not putting resources in our own languages, right? Oh. Yeah. So for myself, I think it's criminal, right? Because of the because of the psychological impact, right? Because then you end up with a generation that's not confident of who they are. They're not confident of themselves in the world stage.
And they lack the identity.
Yeah, I mean, and you realize that when you go, for example, I live in the U.S. My master in English here doesn't mean I'm understood any better there, right? So there's that sort of self-questioning that happens when you go to a store to buy something in your best English, in the Queen's English, and the clerk there doesn't understand what you're saying, right? It does something to you. So I don't know if you want to build identity, then we need our languages.
So it is our languages that we build on for us to get that identity that we need.
Yeah, because in language, as I said, it's as with culture, it's a reflection of who we are.
It's a reflection. But now, some of your works have been translated into different languages.
Yeah.
German, Swahili, Turkish, French. But based on you as an author, have you written any of these books in maybe a specific language, in your language?
No, and that's a contradiction, right? I mean, that's a contradiction of that I have, and a contradiction of my generation. And also none of them have been translated into Kiswahili or into any African language. So there is that. So my plan now is to translate Nairobi Hit into Gikuyu, which is my language. But I'm part of that generation that grew up when we were getting punished for speaking our languages in schools. Part of that, there is a term I use in the Rise of the African Novel, the English metaphysical empire, to show how we are all encompassed in this, in this empire of language, right? That it's very hard to break out of. But I did start a Kiswahili praise. Even though my Kiswahili isn't that good, there's that
it's Kiswahili praise that you started.
Yeah, that I started. It's called the Mabati Cornell Kiswahili Praise for African Writing, with the whole idea of building structures for African languages because they're completely absent. Literary praises, agents, publishers, translators, all those things are missing, and we need to as a collective work on that.
Quite interesting there. And as you had talked about contradiction, there's one aspect that really came into my mind because you did a BA in English and political science from Albright College. But you went into another field in your MA, and you did creative writing from Boston University. And you hold a PhD in English from the University of Wisconsin, Madison. Now, moving or shifting from political science into literature or writing, or let me say into this kind of field of creative writing. Why the shift?
Yeah, so I started writing. I started writing when I was about. I remember my first poem when I was about 9 years old, right? But it doesn't mean I wanted to become a writer. So, which I find ironic, right? That I've been writing, but not wanting to become a writer. And part of it was, of course, as children, we define ourselves against our parents, all the same, right? Yeah. So my intention was to do political science, become a political scientist. But
you changed.
Yeah, then I changed along the way. But then I started taking English courses or literature courses, and by the time I was doing my MA, the political science had fallen out of the way. But for the PhD, I'm interested in literary theory. I'm interested in how African literature has been manufactured, if you will. Right? Like why do you read, let's say, Things Fall Apart as opposed to Mhudi, written in the 1900s, right? What gets published? And so I'm interested in that. And my PhD was on Amos Totiola and a peasant poet called John Clare. But the whole idea is also, I love writing, but I like to know why I'm writing, right? Why am I writing, and why am I being read, and how am I being published?
Now, in all this writing, mostly you talk about the events that happened in the past. For example, when you talk about your book, The Nairobi Hit, It's about a cop from Wisconsin who goes to pursue a killer through the terrifying slums of Nairobi in Kenya. And we have the memories of the genocide that happened in Rwanda and many other political events that happened within the book. Now, with the insider's view, we have some cultural divide here within this book. Some are moving from one country, coming into the other, into another country. Do you see this as maybe something that you like to dwell on? Maybe talk about political stories or something that you want to pass also a political message?
Yeah, I guess it shows I never really left the political science behind, right? No, definitely. Amongst the younger writers now, there's a debate of whether, whether African literature should be political or not.
Yes.
I don't see how it cannot be political. I don't see how you can set a book, let's say in Nairobi, and it's not political, right? You can't talk about Rwanda. You can't even write a romance story about Rwanda without going back to the genocide. The literature is being informed. It's organically being informed by where it's coming from. Earlier in the earlier segment, you're talking about identity, right? And Black American. There's a talk about Black Americans and so on and so forth. Yeah, so that's his struggle. Ishmael, the character in Nairobi Hit, is in. He's African American. He's Black American. But then he has to do his investigations in Kenya, right? What happens to his identity? What happens to a Black American then who finds himself surrounded by blackness in
Kenya?
It
changes him.
How it changes him. And how it challenges him as well, because when he comes here, as we do, which I find it very unfair for us to call African Americans Mzungu, right? It is really one of those things we just shouldn't do, right? Because they're coming from a very racialized and racist society. So to call them, essentially to call them their very own oppressor, really. Yeah, so he goes through all those sort of struggles. But he does come to terms with himself in the end. Right, but even for him, the novel is political to the extent of it talks about the racism in the U.S., the hypercapitalism, the violence, and so on and so forth.
All right, but now, do you see as Africans, do we really own what we have? Do we have an identity, even as Africans? Because some even neglect who they are, wanting to become other things.
I mean, it's always been a struggle, right? It's always been a struggle. You have had. The people, it reminds me of my father talking about Charles Jonjo, right?
Yes.
The people who are truly Anglophiles, who are truly Anglophiles. And then the people then, like my father then, who have been fighting for, for African culture, right? But a political African culture, not I wish we could go back to the old days sort of African culture. It's a dynamic African culture that's trying to find its place on the global stage.
Wow.
So the questions I ask are, can we drive our own cultural production using foreign money, right? In other words,
is it possible?
Yeah, is it possible even because we have reached a point now where most of the journals we produce, most of the cultural things we do are fueled by NGO money or Western money, right? And there's that real question of, can we grow our own cultural production with somebody else's money? And this is why Mabati Rolling Mills, the company that finances the Kiswahili Prize, one of the reasons why I love that it's them is because it's a Kenyan company, it's an African company that's fueling, financing the Kiswahili Prize. But we do need really to think about the role of African philanthropy in African cultural production.
Now, even as Africans, because from the West, they have sold what they have to us.
Yeah.
Can we also sell what we have to them?
We could and we should. Except they also own it. You know what I mean? But not that blatantly, though. I mean, look at what's happening in Kenya right now. I mean, I was saying earlier we'll be learning Mandarin in schools, right? What percentage of the Kenyan economy do the Chinese control, or how much of it do they own? If we add the Chinese to already a neo-colonial economy, right, where then it's the Western countries that are in control with a good chunk of our finances, then there's that real question of what we really own. And something I find even more cynical, is the fact that we are leasing lands, we are leasing our land to Western countries to come and grow their food here.
Oh.
Yeah, we lease land, they come and grow their food here, then they take it back. What are we saying about our farmers? If you think about the textile industry, right? At least Rwanda said they're no longer going to take second-hand clothes. but I think Kenya didn't quite go along with it, right? So again, yeah, what are we saying about our, growing our own textile industry if indeed we are taking second-hand clothes from another country?
I think you still have a political mind.
Yeah. I guess the political science never really left. It never really left. Yeah.
Do you see that? Has your book been accepted when it comes to the worldwide or the global perspective?
Yeah, so Nairobi Hit has been widely accepted, right?
It's doing quite well.
It's doing quite well, yeah, and it's read by different people. I mean, primarily I wrote it for Africans and African Americans, right? But every now and then, I don't know, other writers don't read their reviews, but for me, I read my reviews.
Oh, you read your own reviews?
Yeah, or blog posts, yeah, because you're getting your reader, you're getting feedback. So I've seen people who have found book clubs around, let's say somebody has died of cancer, and then they decide to do a book club on, I don't know, on international literature, and they have read Nairobi Hit. So it's been accepted quite widely. Yeah, but there's a contradiction for writers like me who are abroad, which is that our books then are not already available at home. So in Kenya, for example, only Nairobi Hit is available.
Wow.
Yeah.
But now there's the aspect of identity in terms of now you as an author.
Yeah.
Not born in Kenya, but raised in Kenya.
Yeah.
Right? How has that affected your work?
Well, if I had just grown up with it. So I was born in Imberson, Illinois, but we left when I was very small. I was a few months old, I believe. So I have no memory of that. And indeed, had all things been equal, I'd have grown up here and, and have built my roots here and so on and so forth. But because of the political situation, we found ourselves abroad, right? So then when I got to the United States, that's when my being an American citizen, that's when it kicked in. And then it raised all sorts of issues. Am I black? Am I African?
It affected you?
Yeah, especially when the first time you meet racism, right?
Wow.
Which here, of course, I wouldn't have, well, arguably, because we have ethnicity, which functions the same way. It did, yeah. And then also to be uprooted from what I thought, from my culture here and my home, my friends and all the things that are familiar, then to be in this unfamiliar space. And I raise those questions. I think in every book I've written, I've raised questions of identity or questions of blackness or questions of...
because it's common in most of the books.
I've been caught, not necessarily being caught between two worlds, but living in two worlds.
And having to choose between this or that, wanting to assimilate yourself with one culture.
But finally I realized that it's okay to be many things, right? It's okay to have many homes. So what I find funny, and I didn't realize I do this until very recently, when I'm in the US and I'm coming to Kenya, I say, I'm going home on this certain date.
Wow.
And then now when I'm in Kenya and I'm going back, because my family is in the US, and I'll be like, I'm going home. So I don't know, somehow psychologically for me now, I no longer feel that struggle.
All right.
Yeah.
Let me just mention, because you have here, this is one of your latest, released last year.
Yeah, last year, yeah.
The rise of the African novel.
Yeah, and it's really looking at the literary history, and the questions of language, the questions of ownership, the question of who publishes. It's like a literary history, if you will, of the African novel. Like I said earlier, my most startling discovery was that we have been reading African literature the wrong way, right? Which is we begin with Achebe, we do Achebe to Adichie, right? We move from A to A, so it's not very far.
By the time we come to M,
yeah, but there's all this other literature, Amharic literature, for example, begins in the 1200s, right? We have Afro-Arab literature that begins in the 500s. And then we have South African literature that begins in the 1880s to let's say the 1940s. So the question I'm asking in that book is, why have we built our literary tradition on a false foundation? Yeah.
And when you talk about the rise of the African novel, what message do you think it will pass throughout, even to the Westerners or even to us as Africans with this book? Because you talk about the politics of language, identity, and ownership.
Yeah, well, I mean, for us as Africans, I think the main message is that African literature remains a question that we haven't fully answered, right? In other words, where is African literature in African languages? In fact, why do I have to say African literature in African languages to talk about African literature in African languages, as opposed to saying African literature, right?
Yeah.
It means that when we say African literature, we are talking about African literature in English and so on and so forth. So it's as if the guest has become the host, if you will. Yeah, so there's, I think for Westerners, just to take a longer view, for us to take a longer view of the African literary history.
Right.
Look, the British every piece of paper they find, they own it, right? From
Yes.
Beowulf to and so on and so forth. We need to do the same thing and own the other literatures in other African languages from different historical periods.
Even in terms of publicity, do we sell out our own? Because mostly, most Africans, you find, we tend to read books, but most of these books, it puts to question, are they books that are written by our own authors, our own people, or do we get books from outsiders?
Yeah, I mean, part of it, and I talk about that in the Rise of the African Novel, part of it is because we inherited the British model of educational publishing.
Wow.
Right? So most of us, which is not an entirely bad thing, but most of us would have read, Ngugi, my father, Chinua Achebe, Ole Soyinka, in schools.
I read your father's book, the River Between.
Yeah, so did I in school. So yeah, so we tend to see those as educational, and then for pleasure, then we pick up John Grisham. For me, I grew up on James Hadley Chase, right?
Wow.
So I don't know. We need to change our mindset, right? And teach or show that African literature can also be for pleasure. It doesn't have to be. You can pick up a book by an African writer just for the enjoyment of it. You know.
Now, with regards to,
though I should add, we do have popular fiction writers like Meja Mwangi, David Mailu, and so on and so forth, which again we read for pleasure. But again, I don't know. We just have this distinction between the two. Yeah.
Now, you've mentioned a couple of authors there, and I don't know how would you compare your style of writing with that of your father's?
So what is interesting to me, and sometimes I wish I could be a PhD student and outside our family and study us, right? You know.
So that you can be able to look at yourself from a different angle.
Yeah, exactly, because we are from different generations, right? But at the same time, we're drained from the same history, from the same memory bank at some levels, right?
And doing the same thing.
Yeah. So, but I do think that the main distinction I would make between my work and his is that for him, he knows what he lost, right? He knows the language he lost, the culture he lost, the country he lost.
He writes in his dialect,
and he writes in his language. For me, I would say that I'm not familiar with the culture that we lost, right? So, I'm not with the language I'm familiar with, right? But I'm not familiar with the Kenya that was, right? Before colonialism or during colonialism and so on and so forth. So I'll say for me, I write from a place of almost like through a veil, right? Through a veil, where I can't quite see. And I think for him, I guess he could disagree.
Would you try to open that veil to see?
Yeah, I mean, you can try to open it, but at the end of the day, let me give you a quick example, right? Yes. There's a time we came to Limuru Market, and he was telling me that, we were standing somewhere, on a hill, and you're saying this used to be our land, right?
Yeah.
So for him, he could say it. He could say this used to be our land, then it got stolen and so on and so forth. But for him, he could say this was our land. But for me, I could only say, it used to be our land, right? Exactly. So for him, he can write from a place of immediate loss. Or I can only write from a place of removed loss, if you will. Yeah.
Now, even as a writer, what challenges do you face? Because you talk about not being able to see some of the things, and having a veil that is before you, and sometimes you may not be able to see what's on the other side.
Yeah, I mean, on the other hand, I think there is something admirable actually writing through a veil, right? Which I think I should. It's a joke, well, not really, but
it opens up your creativity.
It opens up your creativity in ways that if I know what I lost, I wouldn't, right? Because then I guess I use more imagination. And then I think it speaks for my generation as well, because it's a generational thing. It's a generation divide, and if I may say so, I think it makes me the better writer. Okay, no.
It makes you the better writer than your father?
Well, yeah, wow. Not really, but but I can say it half jokingly.
Kind of. We can compare it.
Yeah.
Ladies and gentlemen, that is Mukoma Ngugi this morning joining us as we talk about the art of reading and writing. Mukoma Ngugi, he is an author, a professor, and of course a poet, someone who has done lots of work. Amongst his book, we also have Killing Sahara.
The title that's better known is Black Star Nairobi. That was the South African version.
And we also have here Mrs. Shaw.
Yeah, Mrs. Shaw.
Right. And
Hurling Words at Consciousness.
Hurling Words at Consciousness. If at all you would like to engage with us on this, discussion. Be part of it. The hashtag to use on Twitter is Good Morning Kenya, at KBC Television, at Ram Aguko, at Jane Wambui. Now, talking about this book, Killing Sahara, also known as Black Star Nairobi, here we have two cops. One American, one Kenyan, who team up to track terrorists. And I'm seeing in most of your books, you talk about eventualities that move around killings, terrorism. Why so?
Well, because it's the times we're living in, right? You know, in Killing Sahara, I'm interested in the question of terrorism, right? But there's a twist of whose terrorism, right? You know, because in Killing Sahara, you have what I would call Western-sponsored terrorism. I mean, you know, if you use a drone warfare, for example, you know, and you strike a wedding, let's say in Syria or Somalia, and this was during Barack Obama's presidency. Like, why should that be defined in other terms less than terrorism, right? I mean, you have terrorized the population. At the same time, now I'm interested in terrorism as we know it, you know. And it's the times we're living in. I mean, just the other day, you know, Al-Shabaab attacked the Dusit 2 hotel, right? So I would say I'm writing from our times. But I should add, though, that they're fun books to read, right? You know, Nairobi Hit and Black Star Nairobi or Killing Sahara, because they're detective novels, you know, which in terms of style have been influenced by, let's say, Major Mwangi, you know, and the Black American writer Walter Mosley, better best known for Devil in a Blue Dress. And when you talk about Killing Sahara and the rise of the African novel, and even killings and terrorism, do you see it as an eye-opener to someone who has not experienced such kind of things, or someone who may not be well aware or well informed about these things that happen even within our society? Yeah, I would hope so. I would hope so, because you could argue that fiction, at least, you know, in my fiction here, it's an animation, right? An animation of historical happenings, right? In a way that, if I write a political column on the topic, I don't get to explore, you know, the characters that make, for example, terrorism, or the actors in terrorism. I don't get to do that to make them visible. So I would hope it's an entry point for somebody then to read the book and say, oh, wow, maybe there's a lot more to know. And I do believe, as citizens of the world or citizens of Kenya, we have a duty to go beyond the headlines. You know, for example, Al-Shabaab, if you look at how it got created, you'd have to go back to the Islamic Court Union that got disbanded. The Islamic Court Union had the respect of the Somali people, as far as I understand it. But then George Bush, you know, didn't want, I don't know, the name Islam terrorized him, I guess, you know. so he sponsored, with US sponsorship, Ethiopia went into Somalia, broke up the Islamic Court Union. Then that's where you end up with a splintered, you know, movement, where then the more radical elements coalesce and Al-Shabaab. So it's a political creation, it's a historical creation.
What inspires you as an author?
Anger. Political anger. I mean, no, it is just what came to my mind. No, I would say, yeah, well, definitely I'm animated by anger, as you can see.
Well, when you see everything happening.
But also beauty, right? You know, also beauty, you know, but beauty in the sense of, you know, human solidarity. Sometimes human beings can just be beautiful. If you go back to the 2007 post-electoral violence, right? It's, let's say, the women in Kibera, right, who got together and saved their community, right? It wasn't Kofi Annan and the tea drinkers, right? It was actually the people.
The Boston Tea Party.
Yeah, exactly. It was actually the people themselves. So yeah, so we do have these moments of great beauty that inspires me.
Wow.
Yeah, and I think that's something you'll find in common as well with all my books. There is a search for that beauty.
But it puts to question, why political anger? And based on why you've spent most of your life growing up, how has that influenced you politically? Because here we are in Nairobi.
Yeah.
You grew up partly in Nairobi.
Or in Limuru.
In Limuru.
Yeah.
Yeah, and then you shifted.
Yeah.
What is the connection? Political anger, yet at some point, where you grew up has an effect.
Yeah, so, so I'm old enough to remember the Kenya of the 1970s, right? So shortly, 10 or so years after independence. Well, 15 years or so after independence, right? And it was a Kenya still of promise. Of course, we had the assassinations of people like Piogama Pinto and J.M. Kariuki and so on and so forth, right? But even then, you could see glimpses of what Kenya could be. For example, healthcare. Healthcare was available to everybody. I can remember just walking to a clinic. Education was free, right? There was a degree of a higher Kenyan national consciousness that we don't have now. So part of it is understanding quite clearly that we could have a very different country except for the political choices, that our leaders have made.
Now, if you talk about having a very different country, based on your book, the Nairobi Hit, some Kenyans did not take it well. They were angry.
Oh yeah, no, I know, so, but part of it is, and I know part of the anger was that I'm portraying Nairobi badly.
As a bad place, as filthy, and
but this is why I always fall back on the idea of contradiction, right? I'm not writing anything that's not there actually, right? In fact, the reality is much worse, I would say, because you can have the contradiction of a very rich estate. Right, let's say Mountain View. That's the one I remember from when I was growing up. Mountain View, and then you have a wall, and then you have a slum.
Wow.
So you can't ask me as a writer to talk about the rich estate,
and forget about
the Instead, my job as a writer is to explore both of them. Like how is it possible to have poverty, extreme poverty, and extreme wealth, right, living next to each other without and then the country carries on. So I would say for myself, I'm more interested in contradiction rather than portraying Kenya nicely or badly.
You like contradiction?
I love the word, because it allows you. Because it allows you to even interrogate your own position, right? So, because there's a contradiction in everything.
Do you see it as a way of benchmarking ourselves, even as we look at your literary works? Is it something that is a mirror image of who we are?
Well, I would say partly, right? I would say maybe if it's a mirror, it would be, and this is a bad example, but it would be, there's a broken mirror and then you pick one shard, right? Then maybe that would be Nairobi Hit, right? But to get the whole picture, then we would have to do a lot more reading, a lot more historical research. We'd have to we'd have to read a lot more. Let me just give you a quick example of when I say that. So a lot of Kenyans don't know that Malcolm X came to Kenya, right?
Yeah,
he came to Kenya in 1964, met with Piogama Pinto, met with Jaramogi, met with Kenyatta, and also gave a speech at the Kenyan Parliament, right? This is not common knowledge, and yet it should be part of our history, right? So it's a reflection, but not a full reflection. There's quite a lot more we don't know.
Now, in the book, Mrs. Shaw, we have someone, a political activist, goes to the U.S. and has an experience, then comes back. How does that even influence you as a person? Are you talking about your father?
Well, you could argue that all writing is partially biographical, right? Though I wrote this in 2007, it only got published recently. But I wrote in 2007. But I was interested in the concept of betrayal, right? Because we had our first betrayal in 1963-64 when the aspirations of, let's say, the Mau Mau, the Kenya Land and Freedom Army, weren't fulfilled. Then we got the multi-party democracy in the 1990s. Now we can argue, we can talk more freely, but what structurally has changed, right? You still have a ruling family that owns 565,000 acres of land, right? When people are killing each other for land, right? So I don't know. So I was interested in exploring the idea of a second betrayal that's being informed by our lack of dealing with the structural inequalities and so on and so forth.
So as we talk about this, we have someone who has and someone who hasn't, but people who don't have struggle to find or to acquire what someone already has.
Well, or what somebody has taken away from them.
Or someone has taken
Yeah,
it.
or what rightfully belongs to them. You know, I mean, nobody should own, I mean, really nobody should own 500,000 acres of land in any country, let alone where land is an issue. And, you know, and then the same politicians manipulate people.
Ah.
Yeah.
And from all these books, even looking at Mrs. Shaw,
Yeah.
we have some different imagery on the cover.
Yeah.
We are seeing the neck
Yeah.
of a woman
Yeah.
with a necklace. And there's a lot happening on the cover.
Yeah.
And maybe I would like to get it from you. Do we have literary meaning on all this? Because even when we talk about this book,
Yeah.
we are
Yeah.
seeing a lot of red.
Yeah.
And on this book, because you talk about identity,
Yeah.
I'm not seeing the skin color being something
Yeah.
that's associated with Africans. Does the cover of a book also have a message to pass?
No, it does. It does. You know, and you know, I know with Nairobi Hit, which I didn't bring the copy. You know, the cover is Africa as a gun.
Yes.
Right. You know,
It's a gun that is pointed.
That is pointed. Yeah. Yeah. So it does, but also the author has very little control, you know, over the cover. But I mean, of course, they consult. So with Mrs. Shaw, one of the main characters is a white woman who was married to a British officer in Kenya. And we get to learn a lot of Kenyan history through her, right? Or the main characters get to know a lot about Kenyan history through her. Yeah, but we don't have much control over the covers.
All right. But now, apart from the books, we have you doing poems. You are a poet.
Yeah.
It's quite interesting that you're versatile. You're across the board.
Yeah.
We have books of poetry like Logotherapy
Yeah.
and Hurling Words at Consciousness.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What inspires you in terms of poetry? And do you have a different mind when you do poems
Yeah.
and when you write novels?
Yeah, I mean, so that's a really good and tough question. With poetry, I try to answer questions that I can't answer either through fiction or political commentary.
Ah.
You know, for example, in Hurling Words of Consciousness, I have a poem about the Rwandan genocide, which of course I explore in fiction and also in political commentary. There's a question that I still can't answer, which is how people who have lived together for years, neighbors, you know, how one day they can wake up and one person picks up a machete.
It's quite interesting.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So with poetry, I can explore that. Of course, politically, I can answer it. Right? Politically, I can answer it. You know, you could talk about, you know, the Hutus, you know, and the Tutsis, you know, divide and conquer, and so on and so forth through colonialism, right? So politically, you can answer it. But emotionally and psychologically, at some level, for me, it just breaks down.
But when you are at the age of 9 years,
Yeah.
you started doing poetry at that
Yeah.
young age, at that tender age. What is the mindset at that time?
Well, that's at 9 years old. My poem was about two boxers. So, you know, yeah. But but part of it is that, you know, my elder brother, who's also a writer, loved Muhammad Ali, so there were posters all over, right? So no, I think at 9 it's more play with words. I think as a kid, you know, like I see that with my daughter now, you know, she's trying to write a book at 8, right? You know, but I think at that age, it's more love for words and play more than really, I want to write a masterpiece, right? Yeah. You know, but we grew up fascinated by words. I mean, if you look at the tongue twisters we do, it's something then we outgrow, but really at a very base, we love playing with words.
Wow.
I mean, proverbs, for example, or riddles. You know, it's playing with words. Yeah.
Now, on a personal note, do you sometimes have writer's block where you sit, you want to write something, but you just can't get it?
No, I mean, there's that struggle, right? But I think that's why I work with so many genres, right? You know, because let's say I finish writing a novel, I can't sit down and write another novel. I'm exhausted. My brain, you know, is like, you know, you have harvested, right? You have harvested a piece of land, and you need to give it time to grow. So then you move to another little piece of plot, and then you plant something else. In this case, poetry, or in another cases.
All right.
Yeah.
Okay, and there's something that came into play here. You are not in the country, you are a professor outside.
Yeah, at Cornell University in Ithaca.
At Cornell University.
Yeah.
Now, what has brought you to Kenya?
Oh yeah, so I'm here for two things. One is my visiting professorship at St. Paul's University, and then the other one is that we are awarding the fourth award ceremony. We're doing the fourth award ceremony for the Mabati Kiswahili Prize, and we'll be giving the awards in Tanzania. Yeah, this coming weekend, actually, yeah.
All right, this coming weekend.
No, sorry, the 14th and the 15th.
The 14th and the 15th.
Yeah, of February. Yeah,
Where you have, what activities did you say you have again?
Yeah, so it will be, on the 15th, I'll be in Dar es Salaam for the Mabati Kiswahili Prize for African Writing. Then today I'm giving a lecture at St. Paul's University on Black Americans and, and Africans.
At what time today?
At 2 p.m.
2 p.m.
Yeah. Right. Then I'm doing a joint event with my father on the 19th at St. Paul's University at 2 to 4 p.m. And all the events are open. They're open to anybody. They're open to the public. Anybody who wants to come. And
it's quite amazing that you are working with your father.
Yeah.
It's something that is it's quite unique.
Yeah.
Your father, an author, you, an author, but at some point your mind is different from your father's mind.
Yeah.
It's quite amazing the way you can be able to distinguish yourself and form your own niche that is different from your father, who writes in Kikuyu.
Yeah.
And you write in your own way, get into politics.
Yeah.
Are you looking into mentorship of maybe other young people who want to be authors like you?
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. But what I always say is the advice that has worked over the ages, right? Which is to read a lot and write a lot. I mean, that's pretty much how all writers become writers, right? So, and that's how you form yourself as a writer. You read a lot, which then would be the theory, and you write a lot, which then becomes the practice. Now, in terms of finding agents, in terms of publishing, those are external questions that, of course, me as a writer then would be happy to give advice. But the idea of mentorship, being mentored to become a writer, for me, it breaks down, right? Because really just read a lot, find an author you like, read everything by them, try to write like them if you want, but read a lot and write a lot.
How was it growing up under the care of your father, a writer, known?
Yeah, so the thing about him is that he never asked us to be writers. You know how somebody's a doctor, then they want their kids to become a doctor.
No. Or someone failed to be a doctor.
Or somebody, exactly. Even better, somebody fails to be a doctor.
and then you want your kid to be a doctor.
So he never insisted on us becoming writers. And I say us because my brother, my sister, and my other brother are also published. So we sort of became writers. And then after that, we started talking about writing. You see what I mean? So, for example, I wrote Mrs. Shaw first, and then we could talk about Mrs. Shaw. So what we do now is, as a family, we exchange manuscripts. So if I finish a manuscript, I'll share it amongst the other writers, including my father. And then my father the same, and then my siblings the same. So in a way, we have a writer's workshop, which is another advice I would give to upcoming writers. I'll say, develop a community of writers that you can share your work with.
They should be networking and attending these events, like the ones that
networking and attending events, and become your own best teacher, right?
It's possible to be your own teacher.
Well, in the sense that you take responsibility, in the sense that you take responsibility for what your imagination wants. Right, so in that sense, attend events, talk with other writers, form communities, do a reading list, write a lot, and so on and so forth. Maybe I should say your own best mentor. Okay, it doesn't sound quite right, but you know what I mean, though.
All right. Let's look at the tweets now. Remember,
all right.
The hashtag is Good Morning Kenya on Twitter, at KBC Television, at Ram Aguko, at Jane Wambui. Let's read this tweet here, and all right, it's too small, I cannot be able to see it. All right.
What are the challenges he faces in the...
You can read it, huh?
No, in literature, in his literature work. I should have brought my glasses.
Yeah, okay. I also can't see them. There are two so far. Or what are the challenges you face in your literature work? All right.
Yeah. So I mean, quite a lot actually, right? All writers have a manuscript they're sitting on, that they can't get a publisher for. So I do have such a manuscript that I can't get a publisher for. Getting getting published let's say in Kenya, it's much easier for me to get published abroad than in Kenya. Again, because of the educational publishing, because here the value is in books that can be set, that can become set books.
You've talked about it's easier to get publishing outside Kenya. Than within the country.
Yeah, exactly. My experience anyway.
Wow.
Right. Because of the educational publishing model, right? So, but I should add though that now we are having more and more independent publishers. I know Zuki Swawana has started her own publishing company. In Nigeria, we have Cassava. But getting published is a challenge. Challenge here. I would like to see more translations of my work in African languages. And then just the challenge of having to sit down and write.
You're even having books that are being put on plays. And it's
So Zuki Swawana, she'll turn Mrs. Shaw. She'll publish Mrs. Shaw for the East African market, and then sometime in May, towards the end of May, I'll be back, where then at Gita Institute. At Gita Institute, where it will be performed as a play.
It will be performed as a play.
Yeah, so I'm definitely looking forward to that. Yeah.
Let's continue the tweets. You're quite an amazing guy, right? The tweets. All right. Somebody is saying, I'm surprised to know he did The River Between as a set book.
Okay, yeah, no, yeah, okay, I see. So we did, The River Between as a set book, and then in college, when I switched to literature, I also did A Grain of Wheat. It's, part of it is that first I was expected to be an expert, which of course I wasn't.
Being that you are your father's son.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but really, I wasn't. But it's fascinating reading his work, because I can also tap into some biographical details. The one that's most striking to me is I think it's in Weep Not Child, where he talks about a person who gets shot. This is during colonialism, so the colonial police ask him to stop, but he's deaf, so he can't hear, and they shoot him.
Wow.
So that's one of my uncles, right? So
one of your uncles, a real story?
Yeah, it's a real story. Yeah, he was deaf. He was asked by the colonial police to stop. He didn't hear them. Then they shot him. Right.
Oh my.
So for me, I can draw on some of these biographical details, but they don't help when the exam comes. Right. When it comes to sit down for the exam, I can't say, "Hey, that was my uncle."
So I know what happened.
So I know what happened. Yeah.
The River Between is a story that personally I found to be quite sad.
Yeah.
When the way it ended. You have Kameno and Makuyu, and there's a river that passes through, and you have the sort of Nyambura, a love story. How did you find that piece of work?
I guess I did not read it very well. No, I'm joking. No, I think I can understand why it's one of his most popular books, because of the dichotomy, right? You have the river, then the river between. Yeah, and then you have almost the two regions representing different, different
like
hopes.
An antagonist.
A colonial and an African cultural antagonisms. My favorite book of his is A Grain of Wheat, I should say.
A Grain of Wheat. Yeah. That was your favorite.
Wow. Yeah. But I hope he won't say which is my favorite, which of mine is his favorite. But let's say A Grain of Wheat. Yeah.
A Grain of Wheat. Let us look at one more tweet. Okay. How can I get his book?
Yeah, so Nairobi Hit is available. Nairobi Hit is readily available. I think you can get it from some of the bookstores in Nairobi, or through East African educational publishers. Mrs. Shaw will be available actually by May through Zikiswa one. I think it's Huza Press. Will be available in Kenya and East Africa as well. Some of the others you'd have to use e-books. Or Kindle, or
and even as you talk about Kindle and e-books, do you see that there is an impact of digital technology or digital writing on publishing? Is it enhancing or killing?
Yeah, I mean, definitely there's been an impact, right? If you just think about it, just say like you can, I can order a book anywhere now, and I can read it online. But part part of the debate has been whether digital publishing is killing the publishing industry as we know it. But I think I think it's more enhancing it, right? Back in
It's enhancing it, huh?
Yeah, there was a fear that it will kill, but people love books. It turns out, that studies have been done now that people just love having a book. They just love holding a book. So it's not going anywhere. On the other hand, there are some advantages, though. Let's say when with social media, I can post a poem on Facebook, then it's read immediately by my followers. We can have debates that back in the day would have had to write letters, right?
All right.
Yeah, like back and forth. Yeah.
And just as we wrap things up, loosening.
Yeah.
What do you do now to unwind yourself from the books?
Yeah.
You've even won many awards.
Yeah.
How do you unwind?
I play guitar, not very well. Not very well. I've been playing since I was 17. That's how I know I'm not talented. No, but I enjoy playing guitar. Taska and Nyama Choma, that works as well.
You should go for Nyama Choma one day.
Yeah, no, that sounds like a plan. Yeah.
So you also play the guitar?
Yeah, I play. Yeah, actually, I should mention but my elder brother, who's a writer, Ngugi. Ngugi has a record that just came out actually.
Oh.
Yeah, called Hopeless Hope. And
it's available online?
No, it's not yet. But it's been playing. Actually, it's been playing, I think, on KBC radio on Sundowner. Yeah.
Now, it's quite amazing, even as we talk about Mukoma Ngugi this fine Thursday morning. Remember, it's all about the art of reading and writing, the culture. Are we embracing it? Are we appreciating our own? Are we appreciating African literature? Mukoma Ngugi, ladies and gentlemen, he is a novelist, an author, a poet, joining us this morning. Thank you very much for coming.
No, thank you very much for the conversation.
It's been awesome having you.
Yeah.
And I wish you the best even with the event that is coming up.
Okay, sounds
right?
good. Yeah.
I don't know how long are you going to be around?
Until February 23rd.
Till February.
Yeah, and then I'm coming back for May for the Getty Institute play reading of Mrs. Shaw.
Good Morning Kenya takes a short break. We will be back with Jane Amboye. Remember, we have a saxophonist in the building. Do not go too far.
The real musician.
The real musician.
All right, thank you very much.